Harry and Meghan are back in Britain. This is, of course, after they have spent the last 6 years living in the USA, and irrespective of what one may or may not think of Harry and Meghan, they have certainly led some rather interesting lives. And of course, along the way, there have been at least a few controversies. I dare say we perhaps all remember Harry wearing his Africa Corps uniform at a party when he was about 20 years old. And then in more recent years, we've had things such as the interview with Oprah Winfrey, which didn't do them any favours. We've had Harry's book Spare, which, I mean, I've never read it, but it perhaps created the impression of someone who is maybe a little bit self-obsessed. As I say, I've not read it, but perhaps I will one day. And then there have been the criticisms of Meghan's acting career. But whatever we may or may not think of those things, we are facing the reality that Harry and Meghan are back in Britain. And this raises the issue of, well, coming home is one thing, but coming back is something else entirely, or could be something else entirely. And this raises a much older question. What actually happens when a member of the royal family ends up outside of the monarchy? Well, let's begin by thinking about what coming back might actually mean. And this isn't necessarily something that is just specific to Harry. We're thinking about it in a general sense right now, and then we'll go into thinking about the detail around it all. And this raises a much older question. What actually happens when a member of the royal family exists outside of the monarchy or ends up outside of the monarchy? Well, let's consider what coming back might actually mean for a member of the royal family. In its simplest form, coming back could be defined geographically. Harry is, of course, back in Britain. In some other senses, we might define coming back as involving some sort of public rehabilitation or some kind of reconciliation within the royal family itself. And if we think about, certainly if we were to factor in the more historical context around all of this, then coming back could involve, if not immediately, then at some stage in the future, resuming some sort of official royal role or capacity. And in a very historical sense, coming back could include getting control of the throne. Now, this isn't to suggest that Harry will actually be doing that, but within a historical context, that is something that has happened to members of the royal family in centuries gone by. And on a side note, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you who've watched my videos and liked and subscribed up till now. Really do appreciate it. And if you are finding this content interesting and or useful, please do hit like and subscribe if you've not already done so. Well, the first example that comes to my mind would of course be Edward VIII. Edward VIII became king in January 1936, but his desire to marry the American Wallis Simpson created a constitutional crisis, and by December 1936, Edward VIII abdicated. This meant that George VI became King of England. Following his abdication, Edward VIII became the Duke of Windsor. He ended up marrying Wallis Simpson, and he basically retained his royal identity. He, of course, would end up spending much of the rest of his life living abroad, and he spent the years from 1940 to 1945 as the governor of the Bahamas. And Edward VIII, well, rather the Duke of Windsor as he became, ended up dying in 1972. But Edward remained famous, and he basically retained his royal identity. Now, Harry, whilst he's not an abdicated king, also retains a royal identity, and he also exists outside of the working monarchy. So we have an interesting comparison there. The next example, which springs to my mind, is actually James II. James II succeeded to the throne in 1685, but because of his Catholicism, he ended up alienating much of the Protestant political establishment at the time. And in 1688, William of Orange invaded, and James II quickly found that his military and his political support collapsed, and James ended up in exile. However, James II, unlike Edward VIII, did not accept his exile. He did not accept his existence outside of the institution of the monarchy. He refused to accept that he had lost his throne. And this meant that James II acquired foreign support, notably from France, and he ended up trying to reclaim his throne. He ended up trying to reclaim the kingdoms that he'd lost. And so he landed in Ireland and was defeated by William at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. And from that point onwards, James II would live the rest of his life in exile, eventually dying in 1701. Now, this isn't to say, far from it in fact, that Harry represents some sort of Jacobite-style rebel who could potentially lead some sort of military threat or challenge to the throne. No, he really couldn't. But the lesson of James II is very interesting within both the context of the history of the monarchy and also with Harry's general situation. Because what James II represented was a royal who basically formed an alternative court. Now, the significance of this, as I say, is not that Harry's going to end up leading some sort of military uprising or whatever. Absolutely not. But the lesson here is that the monarchy has historically been quite anxious about any sort of independent royal brands that create or could create institutional tensions. And if Harry is existing or continues to exist outside of the main working royal family, then this could continue to create some sort of tension, which might be difficult to navigate or difficult to resolve. Now, the next example, which comes to my mind, is Charles II. And Charles II's circumstances were vastly more extreme. His father, Charles I, had been executed in January 1649. And this was because Charles I had fought and lost both the First and the Second English Civil War. And leading parliamentarian figures and key individuals and leaders within the New Model Army blamed Charles for those wars. They blamed Charles for all the bloodshed and all the destruction that had occurred throughout the 1640s. And so Charles I became known as that man of blood. They saw him as being personally responsible for all the problems that had happened throughout those years. Charles II would actually spend much of the 1650s living in exile. However, he was recognised by the Scots as their king. And of course, in 1651, Charles II attempted to reclaim the throne by launching a military campaign which would culminate in the Battle of Worcester, which he lost. And of course, what followed was Charles's rather famous escape from England, which, if it's a story that you're not familiar with, it's actually something that I intend on telling you all about in another video. But nonetheless, Charles II went on this on the run, basically, and managed to escape to France eventually following his defeat at the Battle of Worcester. Now, where the story for Charles gets really interesting for our purposes here is really when the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, who was basically running the country throughout the 1650s, well, he died in 1658. Now, although the actual title and position of Lord Protector was not really meant to be an hereditary position, the reality is that Oliver Cromwell's son, Richard, briefly became the Lord Protector, although he proved rather ineffective. And the upshot of all this was that in 1660, Charles II was able to come back to England, and he returned to England in May 1660. And this represents a remarkable turnaround. What we're seeing here is not simply a case of, oh, the outsider's made a comeback. Not simply that, no. What we're actually seeing here is full-on restoration. In Charles II's case, it wasn't really about him adapting himself to the existing situation. Rather, what we're actually seeing here is the entire institution of government that had existed throughout the 1650s, that itself changed, and we ended up with the monarchy being restored. But alongside these examples I've discussed, there lies another rather more fundamental question, which is especially relevant to Harry and his situation. And that question is, why does the monarchy produce outsiders? Why does the monarchy produce people who can basically be so close to the throne and yet find themselves with no obvious role at all? The answer lies in the necessity, in a historical sense, of the monarchy to have some sort of insurance. It needed an heir, but, as the saying these days goes, it also needed a spare. Why? Because over centuries, throughout history, life expectancy was rather shorter. Children could die, dynasties could collapse, and so it was necessary to have other children who could potentially inherit the throne. And there are plenty of examples of this in British history. We could take, for instance, Henry VIII. He was never meant to be the immediate heir to the throne. No, it was his brother Arthur. And of course Arthur died. This meant that Henry VIII would ultimately become King of England. Another example that we could point to was Charles I. Similarly, he was not intended or not expected to be the heir to the throne. It was actually his brother Henry, and also, of course, Henry, like with Henry VIII's brother Arthur, died. And this meant that Charles would become Charles I, not that it did him any good. And another example would be George V, who only inherited the throne because Albert Victor died. And then, of course, we come to George VI, who only became king because Edward VIII abdicated. So in an historical sense, having multiple children, having the heir and the so-called spare, is all part of dynastic risk management. And yet this also creates something of a paradox, because once the heir has himself had children, they themselves have children, and so on, well, the so-called spare actually becomes seemingly less relevant, as they are less likely to actually inherit the throne. And yet, even though their significance in the line of succession might diminish, they still retain title, they still retain fame, they still retain family connections, they're still recognised in public, and of course they still have a royal identity. What exactly are they meant to do with this? And this is where Harry potentially represents something that's genuinely new. Harry's situation demonstrates how much the world outside the monarchy has changed. Yes, Edward VIII remained famous, and yes, he had the title Duke of Windsor and was recognised and so on and so forth, but his ability to actually construct an independent global public career was actually quite limited. Harry and Meghan, in contrast, well, they inhabit a world where we've got things like streaming, we've got things like podcasts. There are multiple ways in which you can get yourself published and get yourself out there. And there's lots of charitable foundations. There's this whole sort of social media and celebrity culture that they can tap into. And what's new here isn't that a prince can leave the monarchy. What's new is that he can leave the monarchy without leaving royal public life. So can Harry come back? Well, in one sense, obviously, yes, he's back in Britain. Can he reconcile himself with relatives? Well, privately, potentially, yeah. Publicly, maybe. Can he actually remain identifiable and identified as a significant royal figure? Yes, in my opinion. But none of these things, either on their own or together, necessarily mean that Harry could return to the working monarchy. Let's think about what history tells us. Edward VIII shows us that royal identity can survive after the royal function disappears. James II shows us what can happen when royal identity becomes an alternative source of legitimacy. And Charles II demonstrates that under extraordinary circumstances, even complete exclusion can be reversed. And the history of the spare, or so-called spare, explains why hereditary monarchy keeps producing people who are simultaneously enormously important whilst ultimately potentially peripheral. And so this issue of Harry and Meghan. Harry and Meghan, they pretty much represent, or one could say they therefore represent, a very modern version of a very old problem. Monarchies have repeatedly had to decide what to do with people who possess royal identity but stand kind of outside royal power. And so Prince Harry, he may very well have come back, he may very well have returned home in that geographical sense, but history suggests that whether he can actually truly come back is a rather different affair and a rather different matter. And we'll see how that pans out over the coming weeks, months, and even years. I hope you found my little talk on this subject interesting and useful. And if you have, please do hit like and subscribe. And I'd like to say thank you to all of you who've watched my videos up till now and who've supported me by subscribing and sharing my videos and so on. I really do appreciate that. So thank you all very, very much. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. I'll see you in the next one. Cheerio.